Okay, let me start though first with the with Epstein file stuff. It's the most beautiful possible self-own that there's ever been. And I kind of saw this coming, and anyone with any sense, it's not like it's a great insight like months ago. And for those of you who didn't listen to me at the time or weren't around, there is no good strategy at this point for the Trump administration regarding the Epstein files. The what I'm going to call the Epstein assumption, that assumption being specifically the belief that the criminality contained in the Epstein files extends to broad sets of actors beyond what is currently known or provable. That is what I'm referring to as the Epstein assumption. That assumption has essentially become the mainstream opinion, as far as I can understand it. And in fact, now there is a taboo. There is a social taboo against raising objections to that assumption. We have plenty of evidence that suggests that Epstein himself did stuff. Ghislaine Maxwell knew stuff, right? We have plenty of evidence of that, but this kind of broader entangling opinions, those like have not been proven, right? No smoking gun, and not even anything to suggest a good chance of particular actors having criminality. Nothing that I would say would show beyond even like preponderance of evidence, in my opinion, that's been publicly available of culpability in this context. But if I were to express that opinion in a video that specifically titled like what you don't want to know about the Epstein files is like we don't know all this other stuff, it would be not well received. There is now a social penalty for expressing even just like lack of being convinced regarding the what I'm calling the Epstein assumption. That's like the state of discourse as I understand it. And the best, I think, example of this is Michael Tracy. Now, there's reasons to be annoyed with Tracy in other shit, right? Because he takes it too far. He will call a lot of the people who sued Epstein associates, etc., like hysterical. He takes issue with the laws in the first place. These notions of like trafficking victims without any kind of violent component nexus, like the kind of coercion version of trafficking. So Tracy takes it like in a direction which I think you don't have to, but he will say like actually true statements and get destroyed for them. And again, I'm not defending the broader like Tracy worldview to the extent that there is one, or his broader set of opinions about trafficking laws and shit. But it really is to the point where expressing not like an affirmative belief that it didn't happen, but even just like skepticism. So that's the state of like the current discourse and the current taboos, right? The taboos are not asserting the Epstein assumption, not saying that it extends further, right? And in fact, not only is that the current state of taboo that you'll get criticized, you yourself will be called a sex offender if you express, or sympathy to a sex offender, if you express not just a view of like against the Epstein narrative, but even if you take the skeptical view of like, well, I don't know, you will be in danger of being labeled an apologist for sex offenders and yourself being like that. That is how strong the taboo is on expressing sometimes even just agnosticism as to the scope of the Epstein narrative. That has been brewing, and a lot of that is the result of internal closed systems of thought, both on the right and the left, but primarily in its most virulent form in the MAGA base, who for years have been stoking the embers of this conspiracy. And it's not just the kind of dissident right faction, not just Groypers, right, who can see a potential Israel connection. You know, Epstein had connections with politicians from Israel, etc. Not just them. We've talked about it, right? Like the current heads of the FBI, one of them is about to leave, Dan Bongino, foreseeable, and Kash Patel, that was like central to their narratives. And it was central also to the MAGA broader narrative, who see Trump as a rejuvenating force and as part of their myth, the figure who is going to expose an entire cabal run by international pedophiles, okay? Globalist pedophiles. That is like part of their belief system. And it's been reinforced and re-ingrained and coincides with other sorts of conspiracies that have been allowed to fester without any kind of critical lens. And that's partially a result of the lack of any real self-checking mechanism within MAGA, within the factions of the right who profess it as fact. So Trump, even though he himself was a little more cagey about the Epstein files release, did come in with an understanding by his surrogates, J.D. Vance, his son, his supporters, that a top ticket item was the release of these Epstein files. So upon entering office, the smart thing to do, I think, if you're Trump, is to release the Epstein files. If you're the DOJ, to release the Epstein files. This and thereby fulfill what you were promising to do and what your base wants to see. But here's a problem. They didn't do it. And what's more, they acted like they were gonna do it initially. And when it turned out that they weren't willing to do it, everyone, of course, asks why. Why? It can't be that Epstein himself isn't involved in broader sets of criminality that implicates other people in the way that the MAGA myth implies, because that is dogma. That is an assumption. That's not something that needs to be proven. Right? It would be like proving, for a lot of religious people that God exists or doesn't. He just does exist in the mind of a lot of religious people. It's axiomatic. It's an assumption. So that can't be it. So his supporters were absolutely confused, especially because they had the right people in the positions of power as they understood it. Dan Bongino, Kash Patel. They had the people. This was the glorious, a golden age. Here's the problem. It either is the case that the Epstein assumption is true, or it's the case that the Epstein assumption is false. Can't be anything else. It either is the case that it reaches a certain threshold of criminality that spreads across, or it doesn't. It kind of just ends at Epstein and the people that we know about. Maybe there's some embarrassing stuff, but not the kind of the network that is being implied by the story. Maybe there are certain graphic videos and photos of people in prominent positions, but maybe it doesn't go much farther than that. Maybe it's legal conduct. If the Epstein assumption is true, if it extends broadly in the way that many people think it does, then the conduct by the administration is some of the worst corruption of all time, right? Because at a bare minimum, Trump and his associates, affiliates, and employees are covering up child sex abuse. This is the narrative, by the way, that a lot of even politicians are running with, Democrats and the dissident Republicans. The Democrats are doing so in a manner opportunistically, and I sometimes say even a little dangerously. But the real target here are the Republicans who onboard that assumption. But if it's true, this cover-up is one of the worst acts a presidential administration has ever done, right? All this attention on these things, and we're covering it up to protect, intel agencies or foreign countries like Israel or like UK or something, or elites. And Trump supposedly, though it's obviously false, he loves elites, he surrounds himself with elites, he craves the attention and adoration of elites, protecting them from these accusations. It is so counter to the fake narrative as presented by MAGA. And it is one of the worst things that any administration has ever done, if the assumption is true. And even if it is true and they release the information, why did you wait this long, right? So even as it is, and this is why it's so effective if you're arguing from the Democratic position to use this in debates with Republicans, is because there's not a good answer, as we'll see. Even up till now, the conduct is totally beyond the pale if the assumption is true. For the last 10 months or so, 10, 11 months, you've been covering up one of the worst scandals in American history, merely to protect elites, perhaps intelligence agencies, etc. It's a vulnerability if it's true, right? There's another problem if the assumption is true. Namely, where are the charges, right? Why are we talking about releasing documents at this stage? Because the release of documents, why do people want the documents? Presumably they want the documents because they want to see people in handcuffs. They want to see people behind bars. So if the assumption is true and they release information, why wouldn't they also charge? or at least announce who, has some sealed indictments or something, or announce who the bad actors are and why they can't charge them. So the fact that we're talking about releasing documents and not about charging, it means like, well, they can't be trusted to charge. No one trusts the administration to actually charge. So we shouldn't be talking about document releases at this stage. We should be talking about investigations and indictments. If you can't trust the administration to charge the part of the broader web of affiliates that is onboarded by the Epstein assumption, you can't trust them to release the documents. Do you understand? Trust is not this kind of like this concept that is so limited in its scope to like certain discrete issues. Trust has a way of infecting everything about a person's conduct, personality, etc. For some people that after a while, oh, I trust them with this, I don't trust them with that, right? But the kind of trust with respect to government conduct, corruption, this is all like intermingled. It really doesn't make sense to say things like, well, I trust them to release the documents, but I don't trust them to bring the charges. And so the very posture of this is premised on a lack of action by the Department of Justice. After telling the public, in other words, that there are not going to be any more indictments, the cases are closed. The fact that we're asking for documents presupposes lack of trust. You haven't done your work, department. We're not satisfied, so the public wants to see it. The public wants to see it because we don't trust your decision making. There are too many questions that we feel have not been satisfactorily resolved. These are all things just assuming that it's true that the Epstein saga extends more broadly. And then, of course, you have the Epstein disclosure law. My. How many holes and carefully constructed or not so carefully constructed exceptions exist in that law? You couldn't have crafted a more devious law if you tried in some ways. In some ways, I'll tell you. You could make an argument that the ambiguously and vaguely worded at times and broad law itself was designed to cause maximum consternation to the Trump administration. Because the existence of those loopholes, valid under the law, kind of in some ways contradictory for certain things. The existence of those loopholes gives so much play on the joints for Democrats and Republican dissidents to make hay of what they find in the files. It prevents some of these lawmakers, either as a matter of their maybe they were cunning when they did this, it prevents them from being blamed for being part of the hysteria, because it ensures the hysteria continues to the extent that it is a hysteria, right? So not only do you have the very fact that we're here, it's premised on a lack of trust for an organization who's tasked with doing an exercise which you would almost, by its very nature, would require trust. You've also created a framework where you've created valid exceptions for which the same agency tasked with doing this is meant to apply its discretion. But you can't trust the discretion of the DOJ, because we wouldn't be here if we did. None of us would be clamoring for the Epstein files if there was a fundamental trust of the DOJ's discretion. That's what this whole thing's about. And so the setup presupposes lack of trust. The law requires application of discretion, which is not trusted by the people, and gives almost a devious amount of rope to representatives, both Democratic and Republican, to milk and claim vindication no matter what. And this is the kind of thing where if you take a step back, because if you saw my my review of the law, I noticed these loopholes. I noticed the kind of vague wording and stuff. And some people were like, "What? Well, why would they do this? Why would they give so many exceptions?" It could be because they want to apply maximum pressure in a devious way to the administration. Let's take stock real quick. If the Epstein assumption is true, then questions abound. This is the greatest cover-up in the history of the United States, and the fact that no charges are happening is destructive for the administration. And if there is criminality, what does that mean about the people covering it up? Right? They should be impeached, shouldn't they? Shouldn't they be impeached? So you don't, if you're Trump, right? If you're Trump and if you're a DOJ, you do not want to release real evidence of criminality in the drops. That's your incentive. You don't actually want to release that, because if you release that, it undermines you as a pedophile defender, right? This is assuming that all those things are true, right? That's the incentive. If it's not true, that is to say, the scope of the criminality kind of ends where publicly confirmed impropriety says it ends. At Epstein, at Maxwell, maybe a few other people, the prince, whatever, former prince. If it's not true, it doesn't matter. No one will ever believe the administration that it's not true. Partially because, as I mentioned before, for many of these groups, it's a starting assumption that it be true, but also the conduct of the administration, the existence of the loopholes created by the legislators. And then this, what they actually did. This might be the worst way they could have done it. They released it on a Friday. Maybe that's the smartest thing they could have done. But it could also backfire given the optics around that. You remember what happened on the Sunday night drop of the letter from the unsigned DOJ and FBI saying, hey, case closed. People weren't fooled by that. So just be aware of that. I think this is the actual deadline day. And so at a bare minimum, they can rest on that, right? They can say it was the deadline day. We wanted to comply with the law, but they haven't complied with the law in the following way. Put aside the redaction fight, because that's like arguably too subjective to make a concrete determination as to whether they're compliant at the moment. But they didn't release all. They're self-admittedly not releasing all. And the law says all. In some ways, the deficiencies in the law will work to the advantage of political actors, because there's not a self-contained enforcement provision within the law. It's unclear who would have standing to bring a lawsuit to demand production of a broader set of documents or a less redacted version of the documents. And so, if a lawsuit commences, as it probably will, without seeing the lawsuit, it's pretty hard to make predictions, but my guess is there's going to be a justiciability question. Do you have standing to even bring this lawsuit? Who could? Maybe it's only Congress acting as a collective whole. Maybe no one has standing. Maybe this law isn't enforceable by a court. That is part of the deviousness, or you could say flaw, whether intentional or otherwise, of the statute, which doesn't have a self-contained enforcement mechanism. It'll be up to the courts to determine whether this can even be enforced. But how does that look optically? How does it look optically for the administration to be on the winning side of a litigation fight where they are denying further access to some ultimately loser litigants, plaintiffs, who maybe even correctly, as a legal interpretation matter, don't have standing or otherwise aren't able to bring the lawsuit? So you've now put them in a position where not only are they in the court of public opinion looking cagey by having all of these redactions and withholdings, there probably will be an actual litigation fight in court where Trump probably will have the better of the argument and defending the lack of disclosure. Meanwhile, the courts, as far as their conduct, they don't want to. They want to say this is up for it's up to you, Congress and the DOJ. That's been their conduct so far. Don't blame us. Don't look at us. The individual judges do not want to touch that with a poll. They want to say, listen. So far, right, they have shown a willingness to release documents or admonish the government for bringing cases that are clearly against the law and signaling to the public, listen, it's not on us. That's what happened with the grand jury stuff in New York, in Florida. How's that going to look if the judiciary says the opposite, right? Which would be worse, the Trump administration losing or winning? I don't even know. Suppose that there is an order from the courts directing the Department of Justice to release unredacted information. And it turns out the unredacted information is like super incriminatory or super embarrassing. Suppose there's an order and they don't follow it. Suppose Trump wins and there's no order. Which of those situations do they look worse in? It's a fucking mess. They can't win in that context. And even if all of the redactions were reasonable, and even if all the withholdings were reasonable and allowed under the law, no one will ever believe them anyway. Too much evasive conduct, too many lies, too much festering of the conspiracy theory. No one's ever going to believe them. Democrats ain't never going to if there is nothing in there embarrassing to Trump, Democrats will never believe it. And Republicans, if there's no charging, if there's no wide sweeping criminality, the vast majority of MAGA Republicans will not believe it. And so the Trump administration decides to selectively like put out these Bill Clinton pictures, undated. They have entire documents that are hundreds of pages of full black redactions. You couldn't make it more suspicious. So now Ro Khanna and Thomas Massey, who has a bone to pick after he's been needled by Trump himself, he's gonna make it hurt. And on this issue, he has all the leverage. There are enough people working on the Epstein file release pursuant to the law that I highly doubt that if there is this kind of selective destruction of stuff, that we wouldn't hear about it at some point in the future. There's going to be internal comms within the department, like those by the strict reading of the law need to be released. The law is super fucking broad. It is crazy broad. We read it. And it includes comms about redactions, comms about the destruction or moving of information, anything pertaining to Epstein at all within the department's handiwork. It's a mess. So they did probably the worst thing they could have done. But don't be fooled. They don't have any good options. They have no good options. And that is the essence of a winning issue. Force your opponent to make a mistake. And if they have no way to not make a mistake, you have them by the balls. They've made their bed and they got to lie in it. Here's the question. What do Democrats do? Democrats should twist the knife, make it hurt, for sure. But they have to be careful. I think that there's been a lot of presupposing what's in these files. And the Democrats can't and should not, I think, make the same sets of assumptions that led Republicans down this path. Now, I happen to believe that Democrats as a whole probably are at this point in time more apt to trust the determinations from like institutions, so long as they're in control of them, than the Republicans. But I think the line should be, what are you covering up? Why are you trying to hide stuff? Are you trying to protect these people? But it should not, I think, make any kind of prejudgments about what's in them. And I think Ro Khanna has been like a little close to the line there. I respect Ro Khanna in a lot of ways, but I don't support implying things that we don't know, because it can cause problems like it's causing for Trump. Because next time the Democrats take the White House and there's nothing to reveal or nothing that is juicy in the same way, that can be its own problem. That said, because of how the Trump administration has conducted itself, there's always going to be that thing to put up. Oh, we don't know what Trump did. Look at how cagey they were, right? So there's always going to be some set of armor that Democrats can use as Trump continues to like trip over himself. And so for that, we are deeply grateful to the Department of Justice. Really wonderful work here. One last layer to it. All of this is happening while the MAGA and Republican Party is going through like an identity crisis, where the Groypers are on the ascendancy in some respect, at least online. We don't know how much it's going to translate ultimately to control of the party, but it's happening with respect to these issues, with respect to conspiracies about Israel, with respect to issues of corruption, issues of the elites being in control, issues of, should we let the Ted Cruzes decide things, Candace Owens. It's all kind of percolating at the worst possible moment as far as the Republican Party is concerned. And you got to really respect the degree to which Thomas Massey is willing to poke Trump in the eye after he's been persona non grata. Apparently, Fox News confirms that the DOJ hid the identities of politically exposed individuals in the Epstein files, even though it said that's explicitly not supposed to happen. Massey says a future DOJ could criminally prosecute Attorney General Pam Bondi. you hate to see it. You hate to see it. The one road, perhaps, maybe there'll be one road to getting rid of the pardon, is if Trump foolishly decides to pardon all his administration, and if people want, use the Epstein files as an excuse to get rid of it. Maybe that's one way. If he extends, these unconditional pardons that are not limited in time or scope to, specific issues or conduct to, everybody. Then we should definitely, chance upon it. Let's get a constitutional amendment. Let's get rid of that sucker. We don't need that pardon, bro. We don't need that pardon. We don't need it. Though I do think that there are rakes that Democrats can step in. There are claims that Democrats can make that aren't substantiated. And I wouldn't support making those claims. I do think the Trump DOJ and the administration more generally has fucked up to such a degree that there will always be that reasonable doubt that Democrats can raise as to why he's culpable and they're not.